Professor Kristian Kristiansen from the University of Gothenburg, who's going to talk about the Bronze Age value systems from interaction to identities.
Thank you so much, and thank you for holding this seminar that establishes a dialogue between archaeology and historical linguistics. I think this is incredibly important that we get behind the surface knowledge and really present some of the both explanatory potential and constraints within our disciplines. And I will continue in a way from where David he started. I will concentrate on the nature of social organization, and among that I will concentrate especially on the nature of social and social interaction of various kinds, because interaction and shared values is crucial to understand also other kind of shared things like language. And therefore we need to understand how was interaction organized, how frequent was it, what did it encompass. And I consider the Bronze Age as a defining moment in history, or prehistory, because for the first time there is a new global situation where every community was in need of metal. Bronze played the same role as oil and gas in today's society and economy, and that in turn led to the formation of social institutions that would secure and facilitate trade and interaction. Because if every community is dependent, you need stable political relations that secure peace and order, and you need social institutions and groups that can take care of the trade. And you have a situation where travels and trade are not random or something you do on special occasions. It's a situation that is regular, going on all the time. And therefore, the speed with which values and technologies could be spread over large regions and shared was doubled many times compared with the previous Neolithic. So we see here a qualitative shift between Neolithic societies and Bronze Age societies. Neolithic societies were not able to maintain regular trade and travels over that connected large regions. They were able to maintain it within defined areas, but they would rather be seen as islands that were not connected. And some regions in this new world economy, Bronze Age world economy, would over time achieve some competitive advances, because if they were in control of things that were in demand, like Baltic amber. The extraordinary richness of the Nordic Bronze Age is mainly due to Baltic amber. Other areas would be in control of mines and would prosper until the mine was exhausted. But also what we see by emerging from the Bronze Age onwards are larger cultural identities. And I would maintain that this had to be facilitated by language. When people are forced to interact on a regular basis, you need to be able to communicate. So language, in my understanding, is closely related to this, shared cultural identities. in an economic system where interaction was the rule, not the exception. And this also defined the Bronze Age as different from the subsequent Iron Age, where this global economy more or less collapsed, and we again return to societies that are more localized. It also facilitated the formation of new institutions and new social groups, warriors, traders, craft specialists that traveled and offered their services. And we know now that through the increasing number of strontium isotope work that's been done, that people really traveled. And especially when we come down towards the Bronze Age. We have cemeteries where 50% of the populations were non-locals and had traveled. The whole old paradigm as prehistoric societies of being autonomous and not moving a lot but sharing a few gifts and ideas has collapsed. It's a total new prehistory we are seeing emerging in front of us, one of mobility. And that mobility increases manifold when we reach the Bronze Age. So what we see here is a formation of new regional identities, and I would advocate the language groups. Each of these regional traditions, they share certain distinctive features like house architecture and a metalwork tradition. They were trading copper and metal across these regional traditions. So at the same time we have an openness, an economic openness, a commercial openness between them. At the same time they develop these very, very distinct regional identities. It's a little like the globalized world of today. The fact that we share a lot of things also means that we become incredibly aware of our identities. So in the Atlantic tradition you had roundhouses. In the Nordic tradition you have long farms with cattle. In the Tell societies of the Carpathians you have huge fortified villages, and so on and so on. So they were based upon a distinct economic organization of the landscapes. And we have to also add here, by the Bronze Age, landscapes, the settled landscape were fully organized. There were no wilderness at that time. Wilderness would be unsettled areas. The settled areas were fully in control and connected by roads and infrastructures and so on. And here we see some examples of these different traditions. The North European farmsteads. This was a highly densely Bronze Age settlements where the landscape were densely settled and and heavily exploited. In the north, we have 1 to 2 farms per square kilometer, with a household of probably 15. We have population densities in some areas that are comparable to what we had before the Industrial Revolution. And we have landscape just as exploited and just as barren of trees as in late historic times, for instance in northwestern Jutland. And here we see a tell settlement, a completely different kind of society that we see here in the Carpathians, the Balkans, and here also in northern Italy. We also see a much more complex rank society. In order to handle and cope with these new economic demands and political demands, you need institutions to take care of them. So we have ritual chiefs in charge of cosmology. We have warriors in charge of travels and trade. We have sailors in charge of maritime communication. So we see that a develop of division of labor inside society, where different institutions take care of them. And this new maritime economy I will come back to. So if we are going to sum up and theorize a little bit, or systematize a little bit what I've been talking about here, what we have here at the top are the kind of alliances that were established between Bronze Age societies. You may call them confederations. When it's states, you call them treaties. What we know is that Bronze Age societies were able to establish alliances or confederations of very long distances that would allow them to trade. And trade is an institutionalized exchange that is regular. And we have also, when we talk about travels, colonization, it's an institutionalization of expansion. And to support these new activities and institutions, we have at the bottom new mobile technologies. We have ships and chariots, speedy technologies. We have new weight systems and writing systems. We have bulk transport of human, animals, and stables, at least in the Mediterranean. And in between here, we have a variety of ways to travel or to exchange people and things and ideas. War service. We now know that warriors could travel and take service at distant courts. We have a recent analysis from a male cemetery from Germany, from around 1200, of around 50 male, most of them warriors. 1/3 of them were non-locals, and coming from quite far away places, not just nearby. But they had the same diet, all of them, both the locals and non-locals. And they shared the same grave ritual. Sometimes even 2 or 3 of them were buried together. They were part of the same warrior group. So we have here traders, warriors, and perhaps warriors were also very essential for trade, because you had to protect your trade and your cargoes. So warriors and traders are intimately interlinked, perhaps sometimes even the same people. At the Uluburan shipwreck, there were several warriors on board. Where we have the swords, there was at least an Italian sword, Italian warriors, there were 2 Mycenaean swords. So that cargo was probably also protected. And as I said, mercenaries, migrants, diplomats. And I'll come back to some of the examples. And we have already heard the political institutions like guest friendship and political alliances. We know about marriages between such chiefdoms and kingdoms. I'll come back to that. The new maritime economy that characterized the Bronze Age, at least from the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, perhaps even earlier from the late 3rd millennium, but we see it at least in function from the 2nd millennium onwards. We see a whole new maritime sector emerge. It's being called, and it's very clear now that we have underestimated the importance of maritime trade. Stuart Needham recently called it maritories. Areas that would be interlinked by sea, and where you have coastal societies that share the same cultures, and then would trade inland from the coast. This seascape emerged from around 2300. Einar Østmo has convincingly argued that from that time on we can document direct sailing across the seas, the open seas in Scandinavia. Before that time, you always followed the coast. After that time, you were able to cross the sea in a systematic way. And at least from 1700 BC and onwards, we have the rock art around the coast of Scandinavia. 80% of the motifs are ships, and all our recent research has demonstrated when we get the right figures for land sea levels, it turns out that all of these rock art sites are linked immediately to the coast. These are good landing places where people would meet, make their rituals, do their trade. So these are in a way a kind of maritime chiefdoms. And they had their own iconography. They lived in the fluid and element of water, but they preferred the stable element of rock to become immortal. Ritual performance often took place at ships. And we know that from historical maritime chiefdoms to the right here from the northwest coast Indians. There's a wonderful movie there that was taken in 100 years ago. Maritime chiefdoms, they not only employ rock art as a distinctive iconography for their meeting places, they also employ a distinct ritual of burial. They employ the cairn, the stone-built cairn, in opposition to the barrow of the landholding elites, which was made up of grass turf. And these cairns, stone-built cairns, are normally often situated as the outmost coastal coastland and islands, and overlook the sea. They're built for the sea. So from around 1500 BC, we have in place this new economy with its own ritual traditions that is distinctively different from the ritual traditions of the landholding farming elites. And they were able to connect all of South Scandinavia. They played a major role in homogenizing Nordic Bronze Age culture, so that from 1500 BC we have a completely distinct shared material culture from Trondheim and western Norway down to the Elbe and up to Stockholm in the Baltic. And it's characterized by intense interaction and exchange of people and metal. And here we see examples of these maritime cairns that dots the coastline of Scandinavia. Here from Halland. And the question is, were these also a kind of ethnic separate identity, or what was the relationship? How were they related to the landholding farming elites? Now we can observe that there are rarely bronzes preserved in these cairns. All the riches ended up in the landholding farming elites. So it looks as if they, at least to some extent, had an upper hand. But they were depending on, to some extent, also the trade, the maritime trade. But they had also land-based trade. So you had two competing systems. So no one could really get the upper hand. And we know now that through lead isotope analysis carried out over the last 2 years, and we are continuing doing this over the next years, it's that during the early Bronze Age, quite a lot of the copper we find in the Nordic realm was coming from the Western Mediterranean, Iberia and Sardinia. the Massif Central in France. So this is surely a support of this maritime economy. And these maritime commercial networks could actually link large areas with some with shared material culture, shared values. So from the Mediterranean through the Atlantic to the North Sea and the Baltic, we found enormous similarities in certain elements. Here I have shown the chariot scene from Sweden compared to chariot scenes from Iberian stela. And to the right we see the travel of a certain type of shield from the eastern Mediterranean through Iberia to the UK and Scandinavia, or maybe the other way around, because actually we have some of the early statings now from Ireland, where we have them preserved in leather and tree. So we have totally underestimated the impact of the maritime economy of the second millennium, beginning in the late third millennium. And these maritime institutions shared a language of ships, whether on the top to the left. Let's see if I can I, is that, no, I can't point. Where's the pointer? Someone had a pointer. Ah.
It's a rod. Yeah. Just press the button.
So up here we see a stylized ship in the Nordic rock art tradition, but it's not Nordic. It's from Aegina in the Aegean, from the 17th, 16th century BC. That's how they painted ships on pots. These seafarers of the late Middle Bronze Age, and I can only see that was where the people in the north were inspired. Here we have other later motifs, and here's what they did, of course, also in the Aegean. And here we have the rock art. Again, the huge chiefly ship here and the fleet around him. So there is a shared iconography here that is global. Now, institutions and identity, how do they relate? I've shown that there are ritual identities linked to either if you were in the maritime economy or if you were in the landholding elites. New social institutions defined new forms of cultural identity. And what I suggest here is that the barrow is really the ritual indication, or the ritual identification of the free landholding elites, the free farmers. And they define identities and ethnicities. And we have calculated, I cannot go into this, but it would be between 10 and 15% of the population that would receive a buried in a barrow during that time, even if they built 50,000 barrows in Denmark during 300 years. But we have calculated, and it still only comes down to around 10 to 15%. And this is this Middle Bronze Age that you find from Scandinavia down into Central Europe, a landscape of barrows that existed until the present day. More than 50,000 were constructed in Denmark during a period of only 300 years. And each of them, and here we have an early photo of an oak coffin coming up. Unfortunately, a lot of them came up in the 19th century. We have some that was probably excavated like Egte and Skrydstrup. And now they are all part of a project where they analyze for strontium isotopes to see where the wood came from. That's another story, but it's part of the story and will be in the future. And you see, these barrows are not small. They're pretty big. They're always over 2 meters high, many 5 to 7. This is Bor Messhøj, which had 3 preserved oak coffins at the time of excavation. And they were made up by cut out grass turfs. The bricks of the barrow is the grass turf. And they were constructed in a very, very well organized and systematic way, dividing the barrow up in sections, and each section would be taken care of by a specific group of people who would bring in the turf from specific fields, sometimes different fields. On average, such barrows would take 2.5 to 3 hectares of land that would be destroyed. So it's a huge destruction of land here. 150,000 hectares were destroyed in 300 years through this enormous ritual investment in your ancestors. But they needed, of course, the eternal grass fields for their new life. And here we have a young male warrior. We are doing DNA at the time. I don't think Morten tomorrow can tell you the result, because he has said we will only have results around Christmas time, but we have around 200 skeletons now being analyzed for DNA here in Copenhagen. And here we have the kind of material culture that they share with, part of it shared with the Mediterranean, like the camp stools and the drinking cups with tin nails and so on. And we know this was a kind of mead that they were drinking here. And personal identities now take on new forms. We have these new elites, but the elites are numerous. And wool was in fact the new defining textile of the Bronze Age after 2000 in Europe. Before that you didn't have wool, as far as we can see. It's a new defining textile, and it's a major part of the economy from Mesopotamia to Scandinavia. And we know, of course, the old Assyrian-Carum trade and what it meant, and how they earned their money, and how they would sell textiles with huge profits over long distances, and how they would even sell wool, raw wool, in huge quantities. So the textile economy was incredibly important in the Bronze Age, probably as important as, in some areas, as the metal economy. And likewise, we now know that the salt economy was also incredibly important. They started to salt, make salted bacon. We have new evidence from the Hallstatt mines. It was total industrial scale of salt production and distribution. So these societies are by no means, they are complex. They are complex, just as complex as the Viking societies of 3,000 years later. They are a high point in social evolution in European prehistory. The cape or cloak and the cap is the defining cloth of the free man. And for the female costume, we can distinguish between a married, I suggest left, and an unmarried priestly, or at least a priestly ritual dress to the right. The same kind of corded skirts as you found out in Xinjiang. And the same rituals with slaughtering an ox and using the hide around the coffin we have also here in Denmark. So during this in the Bronze Age, you have these two ways of making a career. You can stay home and take care of the farm, or you can travel and become a trader and a warrior and acquire fame, and eventually return back and raise your position and your prestige. And obviously these two kinds of strategies also define the dialectic of the Bronze Age. On the one hand, you had openness, you had to get met to everyone. On the other hand, you have a certain closeness around these regional identities that were very important. And therefore, you created institutions to take care of these different roles in society. So on the one hand, we have what I call ritual chiefs. These are, we have hundreds of these burials with warriors who had swords with spiral decoration, often full-hilted, sometimes even with gold on it. And they would have razors and tweeters and other things of body care and rituals. They would have all the ritual stuff of the camp stools, the drinking cups, and all the rest. And they are very, very specific group. And there's another, just a specific group. These are the real warriors, because the Nordic spiral decorated swords, full-hilted swords, were parade swords. I have analyzed several hundred of them. And they could be heavily used on the hilt, but most of the time the blade was unused. It had not been used for combat. They didn't need to. But these swords, the flank-hilted swords, they're always razor sharp. They're full of damage and resharpening from real combat. These are the samurai of the Bronze Age, the real warriors that were in real combat. And we increasingly find now in modern excavations all the trauma on the skeleton that show that there was a lot of combat going on, a lot of warfare. But they belonged also, of course, to the free men. They had the cloak, they had the hat, but they were under the ritual chief. They were not in command of rituals. And if you look at their distributions, it makes sense, because what you see to the left is the distribution of the ritual chiefs. They stay home. They don't travel. They take care of the rituals, the cosmology, and they stay in power. You have to stay home to stay in power. And they maintain identity, the Nordic regional identity. But the warriors, they're international. They are defined as foreigners, and they are allowed to travel. And these are the travelers and the traders who move between identities in charge of the metal trade, or take service, war service. They move between South Germany and Denmark in an organized way. So here we have a highly, highly complex society that is able to take care of both in a local or regional maintaining of power and rituals and identities and ethnicity, and at the same time allow certain members of society to travel and define them as a kind of foreigners that are recognized as such and will be received by guest friendship and by political, protected by alliances, and be able to travel. This is complex societies that have institutions for separate needs in society. And in the Germanicus, which I call it a tumulus culture, that they traded with, you can actually identify to the left. There are small differences in ornaments that allow you to identify when a foreign woman is married from her local group into another group, and died young and was buried with her ornaments that show where she came from. So what you can see here is how all these chiefdoms or kingdoms were linked through marriage or treaties that would allow the traders and the warriors to travel up and down from Central Europe to Scandinavia in a regular, organized way. So the question is really here, what do these identities mean in terms not only of an archaeological identity, but also in terms of language? It's clear, of course, that they were able to move back and forth here between Scandinavia and Central Europe. And they shared certain things like the barrow. and they shared certain weapon forms, and they were able to communicate. So some form of language compatibility was clearly needed here, and we can assume. But also they had their own identities and values that defined them as different from each other. A Nordic identity, a Germanic identity, which may eventually also pertain to language. And to the right, I show you here how this system from Scandinavia to Central Europe was again linked up and hooked up with other systems in the Mediterranean. So the whole world was linked up in trade here. And the Baltic amber would end up in graves in the Aegean as part of that global system. It was not a random system, it was not a small random system, it was a highly organized system that in an efficient way carried huge quantities of metal around, tons of metal each year. So, what we know here is that in the Bronze Age we have this global system. And what are the implications for language of these regional identities that was formed here? And these interactions, when new technology was spread, like a chariot, would the vocabulary then spread along with it? Would certain types of vocabularies or terms, would they spread as a kind of cluster and be adapted? I'm trying to show you the kind of societies we're dealing with here. You, as a historical linguist, will then have to see what kind of implications could that have for language change. And I also have to say that I have not talked about the third millennium today, I will do tomorrow. But the third millennium is a millennium of huge migrations, as already David was talking about. So migrations, of course, move people with all their institutions and habits and language from one area to another. That's a very efficient way of moving a language. But what happened in the late fourth, third millennium was after these initial migrations, they would not keep on communicating. They may be communicating for a generation or two back and forth, but after that they would sort of fall down and become local. So there's no global or international exchange system in the third millennium that would speed up language change. So in the third millennium, late fourth, third millennium, language change would have to go through migrations, or at least part migration is my proposition. But from the Bronze Age onwards, there's a new dynamic situation where there's such a movement of goods and people taking place all the time, and new innovations in textiles. I would assume that the whole new wool textile economy would be accompanied by a whole set of terms that will be spread widely. And here by the Iron Age, or late Bronze, early Iron Age, here's, when we have written sources, as soon as we have written sources, whenever we have a local archaeological culture, there's also a language. And I show this here from the Mediterranean, from the early Iron Age, how languages and archaeological cultures here very much. If you take northern Italy or the Alps, we have the Gauloseca culture, we have the Venetians, and each of them, they have a language. We have Etruscan, we have the Iberian, and so on and so forth. But here's also a new situation with less trade. But as soon as we have written sources, an archaeological culture, local culture corresponds to an ethnic group and a language. There's an example here for the Vetones in the pre-Roman Iron Age. Spain is very well researched and very well documented, where you have a specific material culture. All of the Iberian Peninsula share certain things like fortified castro or villages and certain type of weapons, but each group will have specific things that define it as an ethnic group with their own history. And here we have the vetones, and we have others here, where we have the written sources. And we can make these comparative studies. And I think we need to make these comparative studies in order to get something on our feet when we want to project back in time to the Bronze Age or the Neolithic. I think the same kind of dynamics and relationship between ethnicities and material cultures we find from the Iron Age onwards when we have written sources must pertain to previous periods as well. So, and again, I come back here, Nordic Germanic identities, languages, question mark. It seems that by the Bronze Age you form these larger entities. And I cannot, other than believe that they must have had some consequences on homogenizing languages when you homogenize material culture and identities. So summarizing my model here, social institutions are bearers of identity. With regional cultures, I would define as great traditions in the anthropological sense. And local polities, I would correspond with ethnic groups. Ethnic groups are normally quite small. So in the telecultures, we have these entities of 100 to 150 kilometers. And we have them in the tumulus culture as well, that have certain shared specifics. And then we have the regional traditions with other shared regional specifics that define a regional identity based on interaction. These are the kind of modules that we can begin to define now for later prehistory and for the Bronze Age. And in my understanding, must have certain implications for how we understand language and as well. Now let me give you an example here, a case study here of a migration, because migration certainly also took place in some periods. Some periods have more migration than others. Migration is something that occur at certain defining historical moments for reasons that sometimes are not quite clear to us. But once they start, they seem to take on an enormous, they seem to spread like a disease. And we know it, I mean, the way North America was peopled by Europeans was such a moment, defining historical moment. The Vikings is another such defining moment. And we have one around 1200 BC, another such defining moment where everything suddenly goes into flux, where a stable global system suddenly seems to collapse overnight. Now we begin where we have good archaeological evidence in the Po Valley. Here we have good archaeological evidence of a highly organized and dense settlement between 1500 and 1200 BC due to 30 years of systematic work of our Italian colleagues. We know very well the settlement system, the density, we have pollen diagrams, we have everything, everything is preserved, and we know that the Po Valley was settled very rapidly. It could never have been local. It was settled by settlers coming in, migrating or colonizing the Po Valley from the Alps, and a large contingent also probably from Hungary or the area around Hungary and other borders. We have similar sorts in Hungary and not even from the same workshop. We have pottery in the Po Valley and in Hungary. When the Tell societies collapsed in Hungary, 1500, some of these people at least moved to northern Italy, that's very clear. And form here another Tell culture. Very, very quickly, they take the whole area in possession, clear the forest, fields, and a complex canal system, partly using watering the fields and also partly to protect the settlements. And due to the wet conditions, we have extraordinary conservation here. So there's no answer, no question you can't answer nearly. But what we see here is that again, we see the wool economy, the pecora here. is really, really dominant. But also a lot of pig. Cattle, not a lot. So the wool economy here is very, very clearly an important part of the economy. We know that at their peak there were around 130,000 people in the Po Valley, in this region. And a normal development has been put in here to the left with South Etruria, who has a normal population settlement development. So you see the Po Valley is absolutely anonymous, anomaly. Because people simply migrate in and colonize, and they stay there for 200, 300 years, and then something happened. They leave in probably several exoduses, but when more than 100,000 people leave, they have to go somewhere, and you will have a huge impact where they go. Only the northern part of the Po Valley remains settled, and then Fratesina on the coast, because it's an important commercial maritime town, it remained also settled. The rest is left, and it took several hundred years after this before it was settled again. So, at least as I see it, here we have some of our sea peoples. When 130,000 or 100,000 people leave, not in one go, but in several, the Italian colleagues can show that some of the exoduses go to neighboring areas in Italy. So, and some of the exoduses probably also go over back to Illyria. And which to the right, I think I have shown some of these, I have forgot what it is, it's amber. So it's very clear that quite a large contingent went on the boats and became part of the sea people and settled in Greece, Crete. Here we have an up-to-date map of the violin bow fibula. Now, fibula are dress accessories that you don't trade. You carry them on your dress. When they move, people move. And we see here that parts of Italy were quite evidently resettled from the Po Valley. If Old Italic should spread to all of Italy, this would be the last possible time it could have happened. From northern Italy. But you see also many goes over to Hungary and the Danube, where also they always had close connections to, and some of them had come from originally. So there's a very, very close historical connections between part of the Danube Valley, Illyria, and northern Italy. I'll come back to that tomorrow. But what you see then down in the Aegean and on Crete and Cyprus, how people settled. And that's also where we find the flank-hilded sorts of Spock of type 2 or the Italians, they have another name I forgot, but recent research by Jung and others have demonstrated how they move. Along with the pottery, to the right you see dark surface handmade pottery in the East Mediterranean, which accompanied the settlers. This is in many cases just a covering term for pottery. Part of it has been studied recently and can be shown to be Italian, coming from Italy. So it's very clear that settlers from Italy were part of these contingent of people. And some of them even settled up in Romania. But that's another story. So we have a regular migration here to the East Mediterranean from Italy. Now, swan-headed sterns are well known from Central Europe to the Aegean, including Italy. So you have them on Mycenaean, late Mycenaean pottery here. We have them on lots of small amulets and other things. We have them on the famous pictures of the battle in Egypt. We see the warriors again, and with the sterns, swan-headed sterns. So obviously they are linked to the Urnfield culture and could very well come from Italy, some of them. Cielo Waxman has argued recently in a book that it will be out in December that a great deal of Mycenaean people, when the palaces collapsed, became part of the sea peoples, and some of them settled also in the Nile Delta. And the warriors depicted here at Medina Habu in Egypt are hybrids, really. They're international. The shields can be found from Denmark to Ireland. The helmets have Palestinian Sardinian figures. The dress is East Mediterranean, though. And to the right, I showed just one type of flank-heeled swords that goes the whole way down to the Aegean. But the whole of Central and Northern Europe can be covered too if you map all the types. So warriors were coming from probably large parts of Europe and had taken place in these colonizations and what it is. And we even find sub-Mycenaean graves with Italian flank-wielded swords, showing that Italian chiefs became overlords in the vanishing Mycenaean culture in areas where it was still maintained. Full of Mycenaean pottery, sub-Mycenaean pottery, but Italian swords. Warlords taking control. But on the other hand, movements also all the time went the other way. So in the preceding centuries, and even after, we have all these Mycenaean settlements, or Mycenaean pottery, showing that Mycenaean people, I would suggest traders, settled in areas in southern Italy, and even up in the Po Valley we find them. So this was a globalized world that emerged in the 13th century, where people, traders, warriors, and people would travel back and forth in the world, and they knew very well up in the Po Delta what the world looked like down in the Aegean. They knew the palaces, and some of their warriors would come back and tell the traders from the Mycenaean palace had their roots up through the Adriatic, up to Francina, and we find in several of the settlements, we find Mycenaean shirts, we find amber, and there you have the meeting between the amber traders from the north and the Mycenaean traders coming up to northern Italy. So in a way you can ask, who was who in this world of interaction and travels in the 13th century and after, in the 12th century, when suddenly the movement went the other way. Suddenly the periphery decided that they wanted to invade the centers for reasons yet unknown to us. And it totally changed the world and created the Dark Age. What language would they speak? What would the impact of language be for these movements here? So I'm just showing this that this is complex. When you add up, on the one hand, you have this systematic trade and interaction, connecting all regions in the known world from 2000 BC onwards. And at some certain historical moment, suddenly everybody starts, to move and migrate. In the long run, the settlers from Italy and other places were in the minority and would be probably integrated. But in some areas, they might have an impact, perhaps also language-wise. I think we need to get down to these kinds of scenarios where we can pinpoint, where we can show the scenarios nearly century by century, or at least in gross sequences of 200-300 years at a time, which we will then be able to present for the historical linguist, and then we will see what are the implications. To conclude, the Bronze Age created a new world of organized connectivity based on alliances and settled agreements. It created, in turn, new knowledge about distant places and routes, and the professional traveler and trader emerged and become institutionalized. In the Near East, there's an independent infrastructure of emporia and trading colonies. In Europe, as in the international warrior trader, probably in one and the same person. New mobile technologies accompanied these changes, and specialized maritime groups, sailors, emerge with corresponding iconography, rock art in the North and Western Europe. And we see also new technologies of counting, weights, and writing seals. The new open lines of mobility create opportunistic possibilities for travelers and warriors to take service in distant kingdoms and come back with new knowledge, probably also perhaps new terms, new languages. And in times of hardship, demographic pressure, climatic change is one of the suggested causes for the Po Valley exodus, that there was a period of drought. But we can see they suddenly had to go 6, 7, 8 meters deeper in their wells. And in an economy depending on water, that could be disastrous. So migrations and colonizations could now be organized and be directed towards centers of civilization that you now had a good knowledge about, as it happened after 1200, or towards the closer peripheries, it happened after 800 BC. And this new, larger and more dynamic and mobile world of the Bronze Age was to continue into the Iron Age in early historic times. So really what I'm saying is modernity begins with the Bronze Age. Thank you.
Thank you very much, not least for the inclusion of scenarios about the peopling of Italy and Italic migrations, because we can now say that we have almost followed the whole period from the split off of Italic in David Anthony's paper, and now to the very peopling of the Apenninian Peninsula in your talk. The time is 4 o'clock, but since this is the last presentation, I guess we can use some time for comments and questions. Birgit? Well, wait for the microphone.
I suppose one of the great problems is what happened or what didn't happen, or how much was preserved between, say, the 3rd millennium, when the first Indo-Europeans came to Scandinavian, and the Bronze Age, where everything happened. I mean, institutions like the Divine Twins or whatever. Would the Stone Age people, the single grape culture people, have a knowledge of that? Or would it simply be loans? Or wouldn't you know?
The single grape people, would they have a knowledge of what?
The Divine Twins, for instance. I mean, all these institutions that we know as...
I believe, personally, I believe with, I was so comforted when Parpola, he published this article a few years ago about the Divine Twins based on the text and their roles and dual twin leadership in the Bronze Age. Mm-hmm. He concluded without knowing the archaeology, and I come to absolutely similar conclusions through archaeology, and then applying the text, to date it. The Divine Twins, when you look at all their functions, they are clearly Bronze Age gods. Yeah. They are not old gods. They could hardly have emerged before the chariot. If they existed earlier, they would have had other functions and other names. They could have existed earlier, but but the functions we know them about, the masters of speed, horses, protector of sailors, these are all the kind of things that characterize the Bronze Age world from around 2000 BC, maybe the late 3rd million, 2000 BC. They can hardly be, they are the second or third generation of gods. They belong clearly with the Bronze Age.
So, I mean, the Germanic-speaking peoples wouldn't have known them in the first place. That would just be a...
I think the knowledge of the divine twins throughout from India to Scandinavia is transmitted through the Bronze Age world system.
Thank you.
You mentioned at the end there that there was a deep change in counting technology and weights and so on. How do you know that, the counting technology, without knowing the language? And how do we know about the weights?
No, there have been, there's a German colleague who have studied weight systems, mainly in the 3rd millennium and into the 2nd, and showing that you have already weight system from the Indus Valley and onwards to Mesopotamia and Anatolia and Greece, and each of them had weights and weight systems, you know, in like real weights, you know, we have them archaeologically speaking. And there are also some suggestions that you have weight systems in Europe in the Bronze Age. There are some suggestions for certain things that acted as weight. Archaeologists have been weighing things and come up with certain modules of weight, suggesting that they had a weight system. And certain bronzes have marks on them, so suggesting there was some counting going on as well when they produced bronzes. But real professional merchant weights, as you have them from Indus to the Aegean, we don't really have in Europe, I have to admit. There are suggestions for them.
Yeah, and your map with the Nordic and Germanic trade contact. Wouldn't it be more appropriate to think this network was between Germanic and Celtic, or pre-Germanic, pre-Celtic? Or
I will talk about Celtic tomorrow.
okay.
I'll talk a lot about Celtic tomorrow. So that's the whole question about how dominant Celtic was in Central Europe. We have corded-ware cultures going down to Switzerland and Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, but we also have bell beakers, if they were speaking some Proto-Celtic, going up in between and mixing up in some of these areas. So we are talking about a mixed zone here. And the question is if one of them would take over at some point. But I'll show a lot of maps tomorrow.
Okay, I'll wait.
I'm interested in the end of the Po Valley, the climatic disaster, if you want to call it that, because this is something that at this period it affects a very large area, as you know.
Yes, the Hittites were also had problems with their grain and,
right.
And
even in the steppes and in the Black Sea,
okay.
It's not as well known, but there's a huge decline in these settled sites like what we dug up at Krasnosamarskoye, and they disappear around 1200 BC. It's called Final Bronze, and it's when you begin to lose settlements and they begin to be nomadic in the steppes. So it affects a huge area from the steppes all the way over. And I haven't been able to find convincing evidence of a climatic shift towards drier conditions that affects that entire area. And so I wonder if, do they have good evidence for climatic shift in Italy?
Yeah, they have the wells.
So they have to dig the wells deeper.
Yeah. They have, you know, what we have is, if you look at the climatic, the climatic fluctuations, you have a period from 2300 down to 1600 that is rather warm and dry. Then you have from 1600 down to around 1200 a more humid period. And then again you have a globally speaking warmer period that lasts down to around 800. And around 800 you have this sudden, very deep climatic change to cool, wet climate. That is that lasts maybe 100 years, and that is a real little ice age. And that has enormous consequences.
Yeah, but it's the evidence for. It doesn't seem like a catastrophic.
No. I mean, it's not. I mean, the one after 800 is really.
Yeah.
It's really deep.
But at 1200, it's.
But the 1200 is sort of a change. I agree with you. You cannot really see it's dramatic, but it's there. There is a change.
Yeah.
From a more Atlantic weather towards a more I don't know what you call it, drier, more continental warmer.
Please, what is your source for these climatic impacts?
Oh, there are many sources. There are many kinds of. There are ice cores. There are when you plot C14 values.
I did that.
Yeah, but I have one in Europe for history, an old one, which still seems to be okay. But you have a lot of pollen diagrams also that indicate some of these things. And if you're someone like Bailey in Belfast, who thinks that the big volcanic eruptions will create sort of like 10 dark years, then there is one around 1160 or something.
Now, what is your particular source now?
For the climate?
Climatic events?
No, my particular source for the climate are Italian colleagues' work on pollen and on the actual evidence from the excavations.
This is reliable.
There's a lot of articles in Italian.
In particular in the Po, we know about the rainfalls there. That's very well known, yes.
A last question from somebody?
Everybody agrees?